session seeks to examine the research, initiatives, and advocacy wins across the birth to 12th grade system that build and strengthen policy infrastructures for equitable funding. This panel will explore state and local models of equitable funding frameworks and what is needed to ensure these efforts deepen equity and are grounded in community voices. Panelists will approach to design funding structures and leverage existing funding streams to direct resources to children and students of highest need, even in the times of economic uncertainty. And our moderator today is Jonathan Kaplan. A little bit about our moderator. He is a senior policy fellow at the California Budget and Policy Center, and he conducts research on education and tax policy to support the equitable allocation of state resources and has deep expertise on educational policy and funding in California. So without further ado, please give it up for Jonathan and the panelists.
Good afternoon. Can everybody hear me? Can I get a good afternoon?
Good afternoon.
Good, that's nice. You know, I'm supposed to be raising some energy here given the late hour. I'm very appreciative of all of you sticking around. You know, we've had a lot of great panels today. It feels a little daunting, frankly, to be following such great conversation, but I'm going to try to add some energy to the conversation, even though my challenge is added to by the fact that I got to be the bearer of some bad news about some issues going on in the state budget and what's happening with our economic challenges. But I'm honored to have been asked to moderate this panel on protecting equity in a time of economic uncertainty. Thanks to Kamari for the intro. I am a senior policy fellow at the California Budget and Policy Center, where my days are focused on the state budget. That's what I do. I sort of look at how the state budget interfaces with education in the state. And you know, the way I think about state budgets is it's supposed to be a reflection of who we are as a state, but oftentimes I'm left thinking that that's not as much as I want it to be. My goal today as your moderator is to do a couple things to set some context about why we're facing economic uncertainty, what is actually going on with the state budget, and then I'm going to be introducing our panelists and diving into deeper conversation about how we can protect equity in the light of that economic uncertainty. So first, how did we get to where we got to? Why is there economic uncertainty? First, we should just take a quick step back to 2022 to understand where we got to today. In 2022, we didn't know it at the time, but there was a significant decline in the stock market. What that meant is that the wealthiest or most high-income earning Californians and corporations their taxes weren't as high as we had initially thought they might have been, meaning the receipts from those taxes. But the problem, it was made even more challenging for the California state budget watchers because typically we would have found out about that about this time last year, right? About April, you get tax receipts, you find out how much you got on the table. But if you recall, last year, the Federal Internal Revenue Service delayed tax filing deadlines from April until November. And so we were sort of flying in the dark for about 6 months. We didn't really know what was going on with our tax receipts until the end of last year, just a few months ago. And then what happened is we got the bad news, so to speak, was delivered. We had some inkling of it, but the governor released his budget in January, and that budget basically outlined a $58 billion budget gap. That means the difference between how much we had planned to spend versus how much money we were taking in. And then, flash forward a couple months, the legislative analyst in the state told us, oh, in fact, actually, that gap is now more in the neighborhood of $70 billion. So that is a significant challenge that's faced by the state. However, you know, the thing about that challenge is that that lower than expected revenue base is not simply about 1 year, it's about 3 years. So the way to think about it is we look at a 3-year budget window. That's the jargon we use in the state capitol. That 3-year budget window goes from July of 2022 to June of 2025, right? 3 years, that's what we're looking at with those figures. And the question is like, well, how big is this gap? What are we trying to solve for? The reality is that whatever estimate you're looking at, it's going to be a challenge to try and close it. And that estimate will get updated in a couple weeks when we get the Department of Finance telling us through the May revision where we kind of stand as relates to the budget gap. The legislature just a couple weeks ago took what is called early action. It means it passed a statute, a law, that actually reduces that gap by about $17 billion. And that part of that early action package was giving the Department of Finance, that's the state's budget arm, the authority, not actually doing this, but the authority to freeze one-time spending that had been, in the past, allocated in 2021, 2022, and 2023. And there was a lot of consternation about, oh boy, what does that actually look like? One of the things we understood over the last week or so, that authority to freeze does not apply to K-12 schools and community colleges as funded through the Prop 98 guarantee. However, there's a lot of uncertainty out there. What does this freeze mean? I mean, where is it going to go? And even though K-12 and community colleges are off the books right now in terms of that authority to freeze, we know that when the actual budget numbers come out in a few weeks, there's going to be some significant questions to be answered about K-12 and community college funding as well. So there's some good news. Another part of the early action budget plan, so to speak, that the legislature was putting forward is that we are going to access some part of what is good news here, which is state budget reserves. So the state has done a good job. You and I have done a good job collectively budgeting appropriately and passing rules that basically allow us to put away money for a rainy day, which we are officially now, I would suggest, in. And the extent of those rainy day funds are first in the state's big rainy day fund, the budget stabilization account. We got about $20 billion in the reserve for K-12 schools and community colleges. We have about $7 billion, depending on how you look at it. So remember that 3-year budget window, 58 to 70, there's all these big picture numbers, right? 58 to $70 billion budget shortfall. We're not sure where we stand, but we have budget reserves to draw from. We don't know how much of those budget reserves will actually be taken. That's something that the legislature and the governor will be working out in the next few weeks and months, but that's sort of where the issue stands right now. The last thing I'll say is that the legislature and governor have not done something that we at the Budget Center think is really important to have done, which is to highlight the ability to access additional revenue as part of the discussion around how to solve this budget gap, right? So the governor has been reticent, would be kind, about trying to put revenue on the table. We think that's a mistake. We think it's important to be looking at revenue solutions as much as it is to be looking at the spending side of the budget. And without additional revenue, we're likely to have some very difficult challenges to face, not just in this budget year, but in the years to come. What comes next? Well, what comes next is that policymakers and advocates are waiting on bated breath for the May revision, which will come out around May 14th, just in a few weeks. We'll have a much clearer picture of what the budget deficit actually is. And at that point, there's going to be a truncated, short timeline of about 6 weeks between that moment in time and the probable passage of a budget agreement, that is an actual budget, at the end of June. And in that truncated period of time are going to be some very difficult choices that are made by the legislature. So that is my short and sweet version about what actually is going on, where we came from, how we got to where we are, and what we're looking forward to with regard to how this uncertain economic circumstance plays out in the policy space. And with that, I'm going to move on to introductions of our panel, which I'm very excited to be talking about, not the budget challenge, but how to protect equity in the face of that challenge. And we have very capable folks here who are going to help us engage in that conversation. So I'm going to start first by introducing Miguel Dominguez, to my left here. Miguel is the Director of Development at Community Coalition, a nonprofit organization based in South Central Los Angeles that empowers residents to transform their communities, improve education, and reimagine public safety. As a South Central native, Miguel experienced firsthand the impacts of systemic disinvestment on his family and the community he grew up in. In his 11 years with COCO, Community Coalition, Miguel has fought for equity in schools with community organizing as the core strategy towards long-term transformative change. To Miguel's your left, as you see, Maeva Marc is Kidango's Vice President of Advocacy and Policy, where she equips parents and teachers to use their voice to influence and improve childcare and preschool policy. Maeva is an educator, artist, and advocate for educational equity, where the youngest minds can access meaningful, developmentally appropriate, culturally rich and affirming, trauma-informed care and learning environments. Her passion for advocating for children and families stems from her experience as an orphan, an immigrant from Haiti, and an English learner. Carlise King, to Miguel's right, is the executive director of the Early Childhood Data Collaborative at Child Trends, where she promotes policies that support the development of coordinated early childhood data access, coordinated early childhood data access, departments of education, social services, and public health to guide public policy. Carlise has over 20 years of experience conducting research on early childhood issues and examining the impact of state and federal policies on parents' access to child care services, licensed child care supply, child care costs, and the child care workforce. And to Carlise's left, Angelica Jongco is Deputy Managing Attorney with Public Advocates and co-leads the anchor team of the California Partnership for the Future of Learning. Through advocacy, litigation, and community partnership, Angelica works towards racially just public schools where every child feels joy and belonging. She has built capacity with hundreds of California students, families, and organizers on our school funding system and how to engage as partners in learning and decision-making in schools. Angelica is the proud daughter of Filipino immigrants and a public school parent raising 2 daughters. And with that, a round of applause, please. So as I said, I'm very excited about engaging in a conversation today about how we can think about protecting equity when we talk about the challenges that we're facing, both with the state budget and economic uncertainty generally, and how it relates to the specific policy areas in which we're all so passionate about. But before I do that, one of the things I think about when I think about talking about a subject like this is that we use the word equity oftentimes without really having a clear definition or an understanding, at least collectively, about what we mean when we use it. So what I'm going to start with just is presenting a question about what it is that equity means to each of our panelists and how you would actually define it or frame it. And I'm going to start first with Carlise, and then we'll move on from there. So Carlise?
Okay. Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? So when I think about equity, as you hear from my bio, I think of it from a research perspective. So that's thinking about equity as an outcome that we're trying to achieve, but also the process by which we reach that goal. So as an outcome, I think about that statistically characteristics that are out of my control, like my race, my gender, are not predictive of the outcomes or the experiences that I have. So as a Black woman, that should not be predictive of how much I make, how long I live, or how long my child lives. And so it's really important as we think about equity, and I feel like for too long we've seen those charts where we see those disparities. The goal is to change that, right? That we have a goal that we shouldn't be seeing those should not be predictive, and really thinking about the process for which we get there, which really involves community engagement and making sure that those that are most impacted by any given policies or practices are part of not only identifying the root causes of the disparities that we're able to identify, but really part of identifying solutions moving forward. And that means diverse representation in decision-making roles, it means strong partnerships with community organizations, and it means an ongoing methods for people to give ongoing input. It's not a one-time and done, it's really creating these mechanisms through our systems that really value community voice and make that part of the ongoing way that we use and think about data to address those disparities.
Great. Thank you so much, Carlise. Can I present that question next to Angelica?
We didn't know where he was going next. Can folks hear me? Yes. So I guess I could answer this as a lawyer, but I actually want to answer it as a mother and as a daughter of immigrants. And because I was so moved, Terry, by your opening too, I want to answer it from the perspective of the child that we brought in the boat with us. Each of us, when I think about equity, I think about what does that look and feel like. It feels like that child and every child and the child within us, is feels seen and valued for who they are, that they're in a learning environment that sparks their curiosity and unlocks their own innate brilliance. And that's regardless of any of those predictors that Carlise mentioned: race, income, zip code, home language, ability. I also think about that we talk about every child, but also the impact that that has on the community too. That equity is not just about, these individual stories of brilliance, but actually what are we doing to build stronger communities, more resilient communities that are thriving where we don't have these predictors. And then today I'm excited to talk about what we need from our funding system to make sure every child is supported in that way, to have that experience of dignity and belonging in their learning environment, and from that space be able to learn and grow to their full potential. And that means a system that sees children as human, that doesn't apply these one-size-fits-all approaches, but actually has the flexibility to meet the rich diversity that we have here in California.
Great, thanks so much, Angelica. Should we go to Miguel next?
Sure. Yeah, co-sign what they said. I think when we think about it, what folks have really spoken to today is that there is an acknowledgement that these systems, including the education system, weren't meant for communities that have been historically marginalized, right, and oppressed. And we can think about that in every system. And so when we talk about equity, it is about how do we actually get closer to addressing and meeting the needs of those communities and being able to tap into those talents, right? And so that's how we talk. That's what we talk about when we talk about equity. And so in terms of the education is how do we actually prioritize funding or resources to the communities that need it the most, or who are most disproportionately impacted, right? But what I also want to say about equity is that it is a word to help decision makers and those in power really understand what we're talking about. Because folks have been talking about this forever, right? It's how do we actually get to liberation? How do we talk about justice, right? But when you start to talk about those words, folks are just kind of well, what do you mean by that, right? Well, what are you talking about? And so equity is really the latest word to help us understand, what is it that we're actually working towards, right? And it's not an end goal, but it is an approach that can help us get there closer, right? These conversations are happening every day in our communities. Folks are talking about what can be done better, what is it that we need? And at some point, equity is going to be insufficient, right? Hopefully we're going to get to a better place where we transform our systems and get them to a place where we're actually meeting the needs of our communities, right? And then doing some of the injustices. There will probably be a new word, right? Where we can actually get to justice and liberation.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Miguel. Maeva, what do you think about this concept?
Thank you all for sharing what you shared. I think that my colleagues here on the panel said some really beautiful things about equity. But I like to look at equity not as a definition, but a lens. It's a lens for me to see when I'm making decisions, who's going to be impacted by my decisions? And am I involving other people to help with this decision? Or who's missing? If the decision that I am going to make, is it going to create barriers for someone? And so I like to think of it as having a lens that I need to utilize, thinking of it as, a tool. So we each need to have this tool in our pocket for whenever we are making decision to put on our tool, our equity tool on, and see what it is that we need to do next. So I think someone mentioned it as an approach. So, really looking at it as what we need to do so that it's not just a fad word that we're using, but an actual tool that we have to put on as individuals that are working either in policy or as educators in the classroom. When you're working on your lesson plans, is my lesson plan, am I excluding anyone in this process and what I'm learning, what I want them to learn? And so really looking at equity as how we see the world and the decisions we need to make in the world.
Thanks. I really appreciate that framing in terms of a lens or a tool. And I also heard a lot here about how community and how we try to reflect community is so important with regard to the issue of equity. So thanks so much for getting us sort of on the same page about what we mean when we're talking about equity, because I think it's really important as we dive deeper into our conversation today. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to start with Angelica and talk a little bit about what I know is something close to Angelica's work and heart, and a key piece of what the state's promise has been with regard to equity, has been the state's local control funding formula in regards to K-12 education. As many of you know, it is the key funding formula for K-12. It also is allocating the majority of funds to schools across the state. And last year, Public Advocates put out an in-depth report on LCFF that marked its 10-year milestone of implementation of LCFF. So I'm going to turn to you, Angelica, and ask, what is it that you would say we have learned from LCFF, or has LCFF helped the state move toward more equitable funding, or how would you sort of frame our discussion when we're thinking about LCFF in that way?
Yes, definitely. So LCFF, the local control funding formula. Over the past decade, California has been on a journey of remaking our education finance system, our education system, with this lens of equity. And that's building a system that really takes into account the built-in advantages and disadvantages that are present in our communities. It's been especially strong on focusing on socioeconomics and language learner status, foster youth, unhoused youth in the formula, and seeking to remedy those inequities by providing additional resources. And the local control funding formula, largely because of a big push of many of the advocates in this room and a lot of organizing that went into it, was a historic and landmark overhaul of that system that has led us to a place more than 10 years later where someone referred to it as the Holy Grail, right? That in fact, equity is baked into our funding system, and we have seen that California continues to lean into that principle, even as we get new funding streams, that the default is that that new funding will run through some kind of equitable formula, and that we are going to send more money to communities that have been historically under-resourced or that may have higher needs on the indicators that matter to us. So LCFF is the biggest example and the ongoing example, but it's not the only one, right? California has made a number of banner commitments around community schools, multi-billion dollars, the Learning Recovery Program. We heard Joe talk about Kayla J. And that's because of the hard work that we have done to say this is an underlying principle, that equity is going to be, by default, how we're going to distribute money. And you're going to have to justify to us why we're not going to do it that way. I think the other kind of big advancement, sorry, I'll stop, my hair is touching the mic. Also, LCFF ushered in a holistic and student-centered approach to learning. So we did away with the test and punish and just measure education by 2 test scores. And we actually had a more community-driven process to say, what are the actual ingredients that lead to an equitable education that includes student and family engagement, again, because of the great organizing that has happened in the state of California. And one of continuous improvement, right, that we are about supporting, we're about learning, an ongoing process of learning. And key to this is the third thing, which is embedding partnership and co-governance with students, families, and educators. That was what the last panel was about. 10 years ago, we wouldn't have been talking about shared power as being the job of a school district. You wouldn't have Nina up here talking about the tool of the spectrum of community engagement to ownership as actually, and with the expectation that people would know what she's talking about, because that actually is a tool that was generated from our communities. Rosa from Facilitating Power, Rosa Gonzalez, and BHC Monterey County and Padres Unidos have been training on that. CFJ adapted that for Youth Voice and have been training districts across the state. We have been in a process of learning and understanding that these things of co-governance and shared power, along with the equitable resources and adequate resources. I'd be remiss if I didn't say it's not just the equitable money, but we also need more of the funding and enough of the funding. Together are key ingredients to being able to have those schools of belonging, joy, and connection that we want. Because it's when we take the time to be in community, listen to our communities, that we generate the kind of solutions and the schools that our students deserve.
Thanks, Angelica. So, you know, what I heard, Angelica, you say, yeah, please. What I heard in some of your comments, Angelica, is really that there, you know, it was a game changer, right, in terms of how we are viewing the question of allocation of resources at the state level. I also know that, you know, how this plays out at the local level is, you know, sort of where the rubber meets the road, and that we've had, you know, some challenges in that regard in certain places. But I'm looking to Miguel now to talk to us a little bit more about the Student Equity Needs Index and how this has played out in, you know, with regard to the CENI and Los Angeles Unified. I know that Coco has been key in that effort, and I'd like to hear a little bit more about how this looks at the local level.
Yeah, definitely. So, so when LCFF passed, we had a lot of convenience with students, parents, really to talk about the opportunity that came with LCFF, right? It's like, hey, we're gonna get, we're changing the way that the school district is funding, that the state is funding schools, and the district is gonna get a lot of money. And I think a lot of folks were really quick to try to figure out, is like, well, how do we actually get these dollars to where we need, where we want to spend them, right? But what our students and parents really said is like, well, how do we even know that that money is actually going to come down to our schools, right? Because after doing this work and doing many policy fights, I think folks have talked about the implementation, right? That's where things kind of go off the rails, right? And then we have to fight for the implementation, right? To make sure that the resources actually come down to our schools. And so at the core, the Student Equity Needs Index, it is about accountability, right? So the Student Equity Needs Index, what it is an index that really takes into account and really identifies where there is need within the district, right? Because especially when you have a district like LAUSD that's so large, and I think at that point it was maybe like about 88% or 89% of students who qualified as target student population. Our students recognize that even within LAUSD, the need looks different, right? And there is concentrated needs in certain communities. And so what the CENI actually does is that it helps the district understand, well, how do we actually take a look at like not only academic indicators, but look at like health indicators and community indicators to understand the real intricate, the real specific and comprehensive lens of like how we understand equity within the district, right? And so really like what the community said is like, how do we actually get the district to see us, right? And not just say it's like, well, we're spending the TSP dollars on all these students, and they're not reaching our schools, right? And so, so that's really what really led to the Student Equity Needs Index, and really what the community wanted to see was the incorporation of community indicators in that, right? And so taking into account health and taking into account exposure to gun violence and all these things that we know to be true that impacts the student's ability to like learn, right? That is outside of the classroom, right? And that COVID showed us that really makes a big difference, right? It is the conditions in which our students are living in, and so. We were able to fight for that, co-created with some of our local partners, including Catalyst California, the Inner City Struggle, and be able to work with some of the board members and decision makers in the district to create a set of indicators, right? And so we were able to win that in 2014, a year later. The only thing is that it didn't have community indicators and it didn't have money attached to it. So it was really a symbolic win, right? And so we've spent the next 10 years really trying to figure out, well, how do we actually make this real? 10 years later, this year's the 10th anniversary of CENI, and what we can say is that now there is actually real money attached to it, right? There's $700 million that is being distributed through the CENI, and then we have community indicators. During the COVID, we went back to the school board and made sure that they incorporated COVID indicators, right? Because we knew that was going to have a disproportionate impact on our community as well. And we saw that, like the communities that were most impacted by COVID, if you overlay that map with the CENI map, it was the same schools, it was the same communities that we were talking about, right? And so while we've had those successes, we do continue to see some of the challenges at the local level, right? One of them is the heavy-handed scrutiny of SENI, right? And so when we talk about like the districts as a whole, the budget as a whole, we say like, well, like our students are continuing to be left at the bottom, right? Black students in particular, low-income Latino students, they're always at the bottom of like achievement levels, right? But we don't say like, well, the whole budget isn't working, right? But we do over-scrutinize certain like things like the SENI and say like, well, it's not working, so like we need to undo it, right? And so it's an easy target for folks to like really call out. The other thing is bureaucracy, right? We've had to overcome bureaucracy, make sure that we actually get the money to the schools so that they can actually budget, right? And also building political will. We've had, over the last 10 years, we've had to engage like 4 or 5 different superintendents, multiple board members to make sure that they understand what the SENI is, right? Making sure that they understand what the district actually has been committing to over the last 10 decades. And just to start wrapping it up, what I will say is that we're continuing to do that fight, right? And I think one of the things that is shameful about COVID is that in a time where where inequities were in our face and the system was able to move to really address some of those needs in some real ways, is that we walked out of COVID and didn't see a real transformation in the way that the district functions, right? It just kind of went back to normal, and we're still continuing to have to fight for that, right? So even this year, we had to go back to the district and get the district to recommit to making sure that they implement and defend SENI even through like these next few years as we're looking down at this potential or at this very challenging budget situation.
Yeah, thanks, Miguel. You know, what I heard in there was a lot about how there's a need for persistence in terms of how we're actually going to fulfill a promise, right? And not just at the state level, but at the local level, and that commitment to equity must actually exist, you know, not just in state land, but very much in the local context as well. And I also heard a lot about what local indicators are in terms of trying to make equity real, or try to at least create a framework in that way. And I think that's a good segue for moving on to talking with Carlise a bit and bringing in early childhood education into the discussion as well. You know, given how early childhood programs have used federal and state funding in a mixed delivery approach, could you speak to how the state has leveraged federal American Rescue Plan dollars to distribute equity, to distribute resources equitably, and where indicators might fit into that into that framework?
Sure. At Child Trends, we've had a research project from the beginning of the distribution of the COVID funds to really want to understand how states were using it, but also to make sure that states were tracking, how those funds were being used and what changes to their systems or their funding allocations happened as a result. And so right now we're in the process of doing a national scan, but early on we really wanted to understand how states were making decisions around how to allocate the discretionary funds, around the stabilization grants, and how they were operationalizing equity to do that. And so we looked at how they were engaging communities around decisions, and we found a lot of states, they were doing virtual town halls. They were providing online platforms for folks to give input, because I think as we talk about equity and thinking about the definitions before, it's about intentionality, right? It's identifying where that greatest need is, who is not being served, and targeting and making decisions for those particular groups, right? And so having that community input was really key through town halls. And in Massachusetts, they actually had daily calls where anybody could join to provide updates on whether they needed supplies, whether they were having challenges getting with their enrollment or reimbursement or being able to open, or whether they weren't getting questions answered, at the same time that programs were providing updates on what the state was doing. And so I think a lot of times when we talk about engagement, it's so important that it's bi-directional, and during COVID, things were changing on a daily basis. And so we really wanted to uplift those states that were really in a time of crisis and really wanting to get the money out fast. How do you make sure you do that and still have community engagement as part of that process? The second piece is how they use how they allocated the funds. And so we highlighted several states that use community indexes, such as the Social Vulnerability Index. I think some of you might have heard of the Child Opportunity Index. So looking at data that took into account children health, economic, housing, multiple factors around child and family need to identify areas of greatest need and how to use that to inform how they distributed money, but also how they provided additional funds for the types of services that they knew were in greatest needs in the communities that had the least resources. So an example, South Carolina, they use the Social Vulnerability Index, which takes into account race, ethnicity, linguistics, social economic factors, as well as health and housing and transportation indicators to look at geographic areas within their state. And their real mission is that, you know, how earlier I was saying, like, your race, your gender shouldn't predict your outcomes, is that a child's outcome should not be predicted by the zip code within they live. And so they very much wanted to map all of these indicators to understand geographically where there are areas that may have multiple lack of access or greater need. And so, but the Social Vulnerability Index was created for one purpose, and they were trying to use it for childcare. So what they also did is that they worked with community members to adapt it to incorporate information that was really important for them in prioritizing the COVID funds in particular. So they included data that they had around the gap in childcare, so where there was low childcare supply, as well as because of their goal to really want to uplift economically under-resourced areas, looking at areas of high density in addition to the Social Vulnerability Index. So they really customized it for the, you know, the populations they were trying to serve, as well as the services they were trying to get out. And in those cases, they provided additional funds for areas that were what were shown as being high needs. Another way that states were utilizing funds with California as well was providing additional funds for specific types of care that they knew was in high need. So kind of additional funds or bonuses on top of what they might be giving all providers for infant toddler care because there's such in short supply. For care for families that were working non-traditional hours, there was such a high priority for essential workers that were particularly those that are working in fields nonstop in the hospitals and our emergency personnel needing non-traditional hours, as well as children that were receiving a subsidy to make sure that that care and those providers were still receiving funds, because also thinking about the current need, but also how do we stabilize the supply of care so that that care is still there when people were coming back from COVID. And Oregon actually had an add-on for culturally inclusive care. So providers that were providing care that really supported a child's home language and culture, having that as a bonus. So really thinking about with their community partners, what are those, how do they want to use their funding approach to do that? And I think there's a lot of like opportunities and lessons learned for California, who I don't know how many people are familiar with the whole child framework legislation that passed to develop a whole child index. Raise hands. So I think there's a lot of great, as California is embarking on creating their own index to really inform early childhood investments, but also other whole services for children and families, and they're building their work group right now. I think there are a lot of opportunities to think about what it is we want to achieve, because I think not all indexes and uses of data are the same. I think a lot of what we talk about is that we don't want to assume we know the answer. We don't want to assume we know the question. We really, particularly post-COVID, want to make sure that we're grounding whatever data and that we're using to guide funding decisions around actionable information, but also data that reflects the needs of communities right now. So I think this is a great opportunity to think like other states have about how do you take all of these great existing resources and adapt it for kind of what California needs and goals are moving forward in terms of equity, but also thinking more holistic about children's needs and families' needs.
Great, thank you so much, Carlise. That's really helpful framing. And you know, what I was hearing there as well is just about really its importance to identify what the needs really are and define what that looks like in each situation that we find ourselves in. And California has a lot to learn, I think, from other places in terms of how to go about doing that. I know we are embarking on a big change in the childcare space in terms of how rate reform looks like. Other things are happening in the state in terms of really moving that ball forward. And so I think there's a lot to be learned from looking at other states in terms of how they've done this. So thanks for providing that perspective. I'm going to turn to Maeva now, who I am looking to give us a little bit more of a flavor of what this might look like at the local level in terms of how we think about these changes that are happening in the California childcare context. And what I'm wondering is whether Kidango has really been a bright spot in the state in terms of thinking about braiding existing funding sources to provide living wages for early educators and the like. And what I'm curious of, can you give us a little flavor of what that was like, how it is that Kidango did that, what it is that you can bring to our conversation in terms of what this looked like at the local level?
Sure, not a problem. Thank you. So when I started with Kidango, I started as the community organizer there. And during that time, I took a lot of time to talk to our practitioners and trying to learn what are some of their biggest challenges and barriers to doing the work that they do. And the pattern of the conversations that I've had were always about wages. A lot of people shared with me how, they think they're gonna have to leave Kidango, they're not making enough money, and the drive from Stockton is too far, and we're in the Bay Area. And so, there was a lot of conversation around how they really, need to make sure that their livelihood was sustainable. And so when we brought that back to our policy team, we were really beginning to think, okay, so how can we make sure that we're taking care of our practitioners who are, doing the most important job in the world, I think, of taking care of our future. And so, I think that Kidango, as a very privileged organization, because of the capacity that we have to have a finance team, we were able to, take a look at all of the different opportunities within the different contracts that we have. And at Kidango, we operate, early Head Start, general child care. We also do California State Preschool, and we have a family child care home education network. And so we provide early childhood mental health consultation, early intervention and inclusion services, and all of those things have an adjustment factor. All of those different programs, we braid our contracts together, and our finance team was able to, plan and estimate, long-term based on our enrollment data, and knowing what we plan on receiving in our contracts based on how many children we're going to continue to serve. And based on that, we were able to work on a compensation model where everyone at Kidango had a livable wage. And even though the rates are a lot more in the Bay Area, the most entry-level position, which is one of our teacher aides and substitutes, they're making $26.92 per hour. But that does not look the same for the rest of the state based on where you are. And so even though this is a bright spot for Kidango, I think what this does is it really makes the state think about, well, if Kidango could do this, what do other programs need in order to do it as well? Well, Kidango has capacity. How can we ensure that all program types have the capacity, right? And we're billing for all of the different things that we do when it comes to quality. And so we're billing for the actual cost of the care that we're providing. So right now, when we're looking at rate reform and wanting to make sure that we have an alternative cost methodology that's based on the actual cost of care, to have quality programs, to be able to provide wraparound services for families, to be able to hire someone to do all of those different services, someone, to be able to have or to contract out to have a consultant to do your financing for you if you're a business owner, like a family child care home. Like, what Kidango is able to do, if the state is not able to really support all program types, regardless of the capacity that they have, it's going to be a lot harder to make sure that our practitioners have not just a livable wage, but a professional wage.
Here. So, and what I'm hearing there as well is sort of brings us around sort of back to this big picture question about how do we protect equity given the challenges that we face in terms of resources. And what I'm hearing is you got to pay for it, and you need to have resources to pay for it in order to be able to address all of the key issues that you sort of identified. And so protecting equity in a time of economic uncertainty, how is it that we're going to do this? How are we going to center equity in the ways that we've discussed if we don't have the resources in front of us to be able to do that? And so, what I'm going to do is just sort of try to tie things up a little bit by raising that question for everyone. So what does it look like? We all know the state budget shortfall is creating challenges and uncertainty and threats to funding for critical programs. In light of that, what does it look like for the issues that we've talked about, for your particular issue, in terms of protecting equity in light of that challenge? Angelica, I'll go to you first.
Yeah, thanks. So there's kind of three things I want to stress. I think first we have to be kind of armed. The data is on our side. So the data is on our side that the funding matters and that equity matters, that equitable funding and more of it is effective. And that's why we see the state making investments like the equity multiplier and LCFF, where a lot of our schools are going to see that funding, the schools that have higher instability among their students, schools that have higher levels of low-income students and English learners. And so we have to, even in the face of economic uncertainty, we have to preserve our commitment to equity and serving our students furthest from opportunity. Second, organizing matters, and I can see across this room, like the connections that I have. I'm looking at all these amazing organizers here from CFJ, from Pico, California, Katie from California Partnership, and the engagement and the partnership with students and families, educators, that takes a great deal of capacity building around the skill and the will, because the culture change is not self-executing, as we heard. It doesn't happen overnight. You heard Maeva talk about the complexity. The complexity of that systems change takes a lot of labor, and I know the labor that people in this room have put in because I've been at those late night school board meetings with some of you. I've sat with Marisa Bermudez from OCO, where she talks about being that parent. The door was shut on her to be, engaged at her school, so she went in through the window. She went through the window, and we heard our students talking about persistence. But to have that kind of persistence in the face of initially being dismissed, it also takes support. Like, you have to have a community, you have to have folks encouraging you to keep going back and thinking about how to build, and as Marisa was talking to me about the other day, and someone said up here, and how to be healed, in the face of that, in the face of wanting to come back and engage with a system that has maybe done you harm, done your students harm. But that's what it's going to take to change. And then the third thing, I think, because at the base of it, even though we're talking about changing systems, it's really the humans that matter. It's humans that change systems. It's each one of us approaching our work in a different way. I mean, I think that's why many of us are invested in the community schools approach, because it gave us a way to continue the reforms that we started in LCFF at that district level around equity and engagement, but it gave us a way to do that also from the ground up and really focus at the school site level around a relationship-centered approach to that to that transformation and really codifying that expectation around shared power and decision making. So I think, yeah, at its base, like really approaching with relationships, human-centered, having that partnership, and that the funding matters. That keep our eye on the prize around equity. Oh, and one thing I feel like I was remiss that I didn't say in the very beginning is like, just to come back to the beginning is, we haven't done enough around racial equity and justice. There are big barriers around that, but there are ways that I feel people are being innovative in terms of using the discussion of equity and who are the lowest performing students, and are we being effective towards that to actually tackle that and come up with innovative programs like BSAP, the Black Student Achievement Program that Coco and Ezekiel were talking about, Ezekiel from Coco were talking about earlier, so that we can move the ball and be more effective on that too.
Great. Thanks so much, Angelica. Carlise, can you give us a sense about what you think protecting equity looks like in the face of this uncertainty that we face?
Sure. I mean, I think I echo around the systems change, because I think regardless when the state has a surplus or when they're in a deficit, there are real structural inequities that are just the ripples that we're dealing with, right? And like the work with rate reform, I think, is a good example of addressing what's been a systemic issue. My first job in the field was conducting the regional market rate back in 2000, over 24 years ago. And a lot of the concerns and questions around that methodology are the same ones that I commend the community members and the state for addressing now. But I say this to say that a lot of these are things that take time, right? But imagine if we had started 24 years ago, right? And so I think there are key things that we can do that, regardless of kind of where we are from a funding perspective, are gonna address a lot of the inequities that have led us to the instability, the low wages, all of the things that not only California, but many states crumbled under COVID, when we really had to be able to respond and we couldn't. And so I think working on those system issues is going to be really key and important, and opportunities to think about the current mechanisms and identify new ways, as such with the whole child equity framework, about how we think differently in terms of how we fund services, so that these shifts are causing the catastrophic changes that they do, that there really is a base that makes sure that all of our children have what they need.
Thanks, Carlise. Okay, so Miguel, what does this look like in the Los Angeles context? How do we protect equity with regard to CENI or any other thing that's happening in your work with Coco?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's continuing our commitment to like the equitable policies that we pass, like the CENI, the BSAP, all the other ones that we have within the district, and being unapologetic about that, right? Because as hard as it is to win some of these fights, it's easier for systems to do this in a time of surplus, but then it becomes harder, right? And then folks forget about equity during these times. And the best way that we can do that is by making sure that we prioritize high and highest need communities in this time, right? In terms of their decision making. I think there is an assumption that sometimes these communities don't care, or it's too much to ask of them, right? Because they're already dealing with a lot. But as an organizer, one of the things that I learned is knocking on doors, going and talking to students. Is like folks are worried about this every day, right? They're talking about it, and more importantly, when we talk to them about it, they say nobody's asking me these questions, nobody's having this conversation with me. So thank you for having this conversation with me, right? And bringing me at the decision-making table. And so we need to continue to do that because if there's anybody who knows how to budget in a time where you don't have enough, it is our families, because they've had to do it their whole entire lives, right? So they are the experts in being able to help us navigate through this time. And so I would say that we need champions, we need equity champions that are going to be unapologetic, right? Because the system, if we just continue to do it in the way that we've done it in the past, our highest needs community are going to feel the brunt of the cuts, right? And in a way that takes them longer to recover, and more affluent, lower need communities are going to figure it out, right? They're going to figure out how to overcome those challenges. Our communities won't be able to. So we need equity champions that are going to be unapologetically fighting for our communities. We need budget transparency in terms of like, well, how are you making these decisions, right? And we need to take on the big fights as they come, right? So we need to do away with Prop 13, some of the protections for some of the big corporations, and we need to continue to invest in community organizing and power building, right? Because we know that's going to make all the difference when it comes to like all these fights, and we are constantly engaging with our communities.
Thanks, Mel. Thanks, Miguel. That's much appreciated in terms of that context around how families are the ones to look to in a lot of ways to figure out how to navigate in a time of scarcity, so to speak. Maeva, bring us home. What is it that it looks like in terms of your work? How do we protect equity?
Okay, to protect equity, we know that in childcare, the people who are taking care of our children are mostly women of color. So with the time that I have, I'm gonna say pay Black women, okay? We need to make sure that we invest in the ECE pathways for our child care workers, whether it be, someone who wants to come in right out of high school, or even someone who already has a master teacher permit who wants to continue to add to their tool belt. So, providing access to those career pathways, but in a way that it is accessible for our workforce. And lastly, I think that we really need to, as a field, continue to think about what we really mean by quality in school readiness, because we keep going around and around and around and around and around and around. And we really just need to look at it not as what just the children do, but what is it that the system and the teachers need to do in order to be ready for our children. That's it. Okay.
Yes. Well, thanks so much, Carlise and Angelica, Miguel, Maeva, for providing your perspectives and insights. As we know, the legislature is going to be approaching this period in the next few weeks, and it really it calls us to sort of act. It is a time for action as much as anything, and we've had really robust conversations today about about how we should be thinking about what we are facing in the next period, in the next few weeks and months. But I think it now sort of calls us to, think about what it is that we can do to act. And with that in mind, I'm going to pass it over to Angelica and Miguel, who are going to lead us into a call of action around things that we can do right here in this room at this time.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. So as we were talking about, one of the things that's really live right now is the effort to support school transformation and transformative, racially just community schools that are really co-owned, co-governed by our students, families, and educators, and preserving the funding, especially for the state's big bet and investment in the Community Schools Partnership Program. And so we wanted to ask you all to join us today in standing up for that shared vision of schools of joy and belonging and connection for all our students. Pass it to you, Miguel.
All right, so everybody literally stand with us and hold up the signs to protect the full funding for the California Community Schools Partnership Program. So what do we want?
Community schools!
What do we want?
Community schools!
What do we want?
Community schools!
And we need you in a fight, because when you fight with us,
We win!
when we fight,
We win!
when we fight,
We win!
that's right. All right, thank you all, thank you all. Sure. All right, stand up, everybody. I'll hold it like this. There you go. Awesome.
Are you guys gonna pass it back to Maeva?
Oh, yes.
Okay, so I think they forgot about me, so I'm gonna
We're gonna
come
pass
up
it over to
here
Maeva,
and
yeah.
Stand up, and I'm gonna need all of you to stand up for the kids, okay? We love all of our children, and in order to make sure they have everything they need, we need to support the implementation of rate reform for child care providers
Right.
to address
That's
the
right.
true cost of care, all right? Like what they said, what do we want? Exactly. And how are we going to get it? Fight. We're gonna fight. Care, but the true cost of care. All right? Thank you, everybody.
Awesome.
So thanks so much, Maeva. I'm gonna quickly. Thanks so much, everybody, for being willing to participate in that effort. I'm going to pass this back to Junhee, who's going to close us out for the day. But before I do that, if you could just please give a round of applause for our participants this afternoon.